Hello everybody, and welcome to Ancient Architects. Please subscribe now to get the latest ancient history news and independent research from around the world. Just when you all thought I was becoming mainstream Matt, I come out with a video title like this. Okay, let me just say, I always try to follow the evidence, I question everything mainstream and alternative, and I'm willing to accept a complete mainstream opinion if I can't disprove it or there's no better alternative, or simply if that's where the evidence points to, however unpopular that may be. I found Robert Schoch's interpretation of the Sphinx enclosure far from conclusive. Both the geophysical work and the geological interpretation of the erosion on the enclosure walls. Many independent geologists also disagree with Schoch. JeanPierre Hudan's work on the dating of the erosion, using the topography of Giza and detailed computer models and associated diagrams, together with supporting views from a number of independent geologists, also seem definitive. I followed the evidence and could not disprove the very logical and scientific work by Houdin, and I spent all of Christmas trying to figure it out. It was actually annoying me, because I was working on my own hypothesis that the origins of the Sphinx may date back to the late pre-dynastic period. Before Christmas, the end result of my research was that the so-called surface runoff erosion on the Sphinx enclosure must be dynastic in age, because to get the pattern we see, it had to come after the pyramid quarries were dug and also after the Quarry Causeway was built. For reference, I'll keep up the video I made, because this channel really is about charting my own journey and learning, and I think that that's important. For me personally, that conclusion really was a huge anticlimax, because although I didn't believe the Sphinx was 10,000 years old, I did think it was late pre-dynastic or early dynastic in origin. But now I can happily admit I was wrong. Well, not really me, but it appears that JeanPierre Hudan was wrong, because I received a very welcomed email from geologist Colin Reader, who could provide the hard evidence to say the runoff erosion on the Sphinx enclosure could only have happened before the 4th dynasty pyramids were built. And in this video, I'm going to explain everything. First of all, I have huge respect for Colin Reader for taking the time to send me diagrams, papers and detailed information to help me understand his work on the Sphinx. He was extremely helpful, and his work really should be far better known. He really is a pioneer in the study of ancient Giza, and it was a real pleasure to discuss the subject with him. At this stage, I'll just say that I am aware that this is a YouTube video and not a scientific journal, so I'll try and keep the information at a level that a broad audience with different backgrounds can understand. Colin Reader's most recent paper was in response to Zahi Hawass and Mark Lehner, and specifically their 2017 book Giza and the Pyramids, where the two authors openly criticise and refute Reader's work, which claims that the Sphinx is an early dynastic monument, built before the reigns of Khufu, Khafre and Menkaure. Firstly, Reader doesn't deny the Sphinx enclosure and the monument itself has been affected by a number of weathering and erosional processes such as wind erosion, chemical weathering, daily heating and cooling of the limestone members, salt exfoliation and so on. Every geological process plays a role in degrading the Sphinx. It's not as straightforward as wind and water erosion. Although some people deny it, Reader and also Robert Schoch point out clear signs of surface runoff erosion on the western third of the southern enclosure wall and also on the western enclosure wall. Here the degradation of the limestone is most intense, with rounded, heavily degraded exposures of the soft member 2 limestone. JeanPierre Hudan produced this topographical map that showed the direction of surface runoff at Giza if no pyramids or causeways were built and no quarries were dug, which indicated that if the Sphinx did come first, there should be no erosion on the southern enclosure wall and the western wall should not show the uniform erosion as it does. This all seemed fair, scientific and logical, and I could not disprove it. But Colin Reader can. and it is from the concept of a flow net which models the way in which the natural topography, if unaltered by quarries and pyramids, would have influenced surface water or groundwater in the vicinity of the Sphinx. And well, here it is, and Reader uses a more detailed topographic map of the locality. This really is one of those diagrams you could hold up in an Egyptology conference and then just drop the microphone. Because the natural water flow pretty much matches the erosional patterns on the Sphinx enclosure. As you can see, it's quite precise. The spacing of the blue lines indicates the relative intensity of the resulting flow, and it takes into account the general slope of the Giza plateau and the local variations around the Sphinx enclosure itself. The flow lines are closer together on the western wall, indicating that this is where the bulk of the erosion should take place, just as we see in real life. The absence of flow lines on the eastern end of the southern enclosure wall suggests that only low-intensity flows would reach this area, which is why the enclosure looks more intact. Flow lines do intersect with the western half of the southern wall, meaning that runoff erosion should increase the further west you go. Again, exactly what we see in real life. Runoff has played a role in the erosion of the Sphinx enclosure. The deeply exaggerated vertical fissures and rounded beds show this, and based on the flow net created by Reader, it appears to have happened before the pyramids were built. This was all fantastic, but I still had a few questions. What about the drainage channel that runs into the southwestern corner of the Sphinx enclosure? And what about the idea from JeanPierre Hudan that the quarries also channeled water uniformly onto the western wall? Could the erosion also be explained in the dynastic era? These are good questions, but ones that Reader could answer quite easily. The quarries immediately to the west of the Sphinx would not have directed the flow of water, they would have acted like a reservoir, and there is science and even an eyewitness account to back this up. The quarry is located around 20 metres to the west, upslope of the Sphinx. Before the quarrying, runoff from occasional rainstorms was able to discharge into the Sphinx enclosure, scouring the western walls and creating the intense degradation that we see. Once the quarrying began, runoff from the west and northwest would have been directed into the quarries. It would not have been able to reach the downslope areas in which the Sphinx enclosure lies, as the quarries were more like basins, not this shape proposed by Houdin. There was higher ground between the quarries and the Sphinx enclosure. Furthermore, even if rainfall was sufficient enough to spill over the eastern side of the quarry basin, the runoff would not form a uniform pattern of erosion on the western wall. And another thing, although rainstorms did occur in dynastic history, they were far more frequent in the late pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, and less common in the Old Kingdom. Although storms were devastating, Reader suggests that even if there was no quarrying in the Old Kingdom, there would not have been sufficient rainfall to create the intense erosional patterns we see. I stated in my last video on the Sphinx Erosion that in the 1990s, an Egyptologist saw a torrent of water flow directly into the Sphinx enclosure during a rainstorm, and that this is evidence that the quarries did not stop the Giza surface runoff from reaching the Sphinx enclosure. But Reader counters this by explaining the modern changes to the landscape of Giza. Many areas have been cleared of sand. A modern asphalt road has been built immediately to the north of the Sphinx enclosure. A masonry wall has been built along the western and northern limits, and surrounding areas have been subject to extensive archaeological excavation, redistributing large amounts of sand and accumulated debris. The hydrological conditions at Giza today are so different to any part of dynastic history, so observing surface water flow in the modern era has no bearing on how it acted thousands of years ago. Reader then discusses an eyewitness account by Carl Leipzius, where he described a severe rainfall event at Giza in 1843. It is an important account because it largely predates the modern interventions that influence the current hydrological conditions. In 1843, conditions would not have been that much different from those that prevailed throughout the preceding centuries or even millennia. So, what does Leipzius say? He describes a brief but severe rainstorm that led to the development of high-energy runoff capable of washing away tents and equipment, including iron crowbars. Yes, storms at Giza can be that intense. But despite the ferocity, within a short distance of washing through the camp, the water formed a lake in a hollow behind the Sphinx. Leipzius even said that the lake had no outlet, indicating that this runoff failed to reach the Sphinx enclosure. The severe storm caused no damage to the monument. The hollow described by Leipzius can only be the quarry originally worked by Khufu. And yes, they were quarried during the reign of Khufu, as there are mud seal impressions bearing Khufu's name inside the quarry, indicating that these quarries were there before Khafre. Remember, although some geologists do disagree, Colin Reader, like Robert Schoch, is convinced that the only way for the natural joints on the western enclosure wall to become so deeply scoured and the bed so heavily rounded is from high-energy water runoff, which we now know could not happen after the pyramids were built. Lena and Hawass still say the degradation of the Sphinx could be done in dynastic history, and that it would not take a great deal of time. But Reader points out the 26th dynasty tombs that are cut into the western enclosure wall and are still so fresh that ancient tool marks are still seen, showing that in the last 2,000 or so years, the so-called salt and chemical weathering processes, as well as low energy runoff, have not been intense enough to sufficiently erode the limestone of the Sphinx enclosure. It hasn't even removed the ancient tool marks. This shows that another ancient process did affect the western enclosure wall to erode it, and this can only be the high-energy water runoff. And, as Reader has shown, such runoff had to have occurred before the pyramids were built. But all this still means that the bedrock ramp or roadway beneath the Khafre causeway does predate the Sphinx enclosure, because it forms the southern enclosure wall. It was quarried right up to it. Reader has no problem with this, as he explains there is evidence of activity at Giza going as far back as the late pre-dynastic, to the Madi culture, which I'll be discussing in a future video. Reader believes the bedrock path below the Khafre causeway could well have been an ancient early dynastic ceremonial walkway or road of some kind, reused by Khafre in the 4th dynasty to build his causeway. As I explained in a recent video, there is a trench that is dug into the northern side of the causeway, which Hudan says channeled water into the Sphinx enclosure. But all this means is that runoff erosion would continue into dynastic history, taking water into the enclosure, causing even more erosion at the southwestern corner of the enclosure. But, offering a different view, Reader says there is no consensus on the function of the ditch. Yes, it could be for drainage by design or by default, but it could also have been a boundary marker. If it is a drainage channel by design, why didn't Khafre just drain the waters into the quarries to the north and south of the causeway? Why deliberately channel the waters into the Sphinx enclosure? The only rainwater runoff that this channel would direct is that from the western end of the causeway, so the waters could have easily been directed into the quarries protecting the Sphinx if Khafre's architects chose to do this. There is even more supporting evidence that Reader produces for a pre-4th dynasty Sphinx, including a less weathered 4th dynasty cutting into more deeply weathered Member 1 limestone on the Sphinx enclosure's northern wall, proving that the eroded enclosure predates the Pyramid Age. There is also the recutting of the top of the Khafre causeway, truncating the deep runoff erosion fissures that came before and that we can see continue onto the southern enclosure wall. The flow diagram using the original Giza topography is the hard scientific evidence I was personally looking for, and together with the eyewitness account of the lake that formed in the quarry and the lack of surface runoff coming out of it, as well as the lack of logic in creating a water channel to erode the Sphinx enclosure, well, at this stage I'm sold. The Sphinx does predate the pyramids of Egypt, and therefore, by default, so does the first phase of the Sphinx temple. The bedrock walkway beneath the Quarry Causeway also predates the pyramids, and as Reader also speculates, it is likely that the megalithic proto-mortuary temple at the western end of the causeway does as well, the place where the causeway leads to. Some even speculate there was an earlier structure beneath the Quarry Pyramid, and I have shown in previous videos how it could have been enlarged. I still believe the pyramids as we see them today were created in the 4th dynasty, but I am now without doubt that there was activity on the Giza plateau before. The earliest archaeological finds at Giza are 4 well-preserved jars from the late pre-dynastic Madi culture, apparently found in the 1800s at the foot of the Great Pyramid, which experts believe were funerary in origin and not indicative of a settlement. Therefore, Giza could have been a more ancient necropolis and ritual landscape way before the 4th dynasty, as I alluded to many months ago. I am still working on my idea that the original Proto-Sphinx is this image on the Narmer palette, which is said to represent the Horus kings from the south conquering the people of the Delta, the northern Madi culture. But is this really just a hieroglyphic depiction of the Delta people as Egyptology tells us? Or could it actually be a real physical symbol of this culture? A depiction of a large rock-cut statue dedicated to their king or maybe a god? Could this be the original Sphinx before the addition of masonry in the Old Kingdom turned it into a lion? I'll discuss all this and more in a future video. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Ancient Architects. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel, please like the video, and please leave a comment below. Thank you very much.